Some poets write for themselves, some write for the world, but only a few are officially honored as the voice of the nation, and they are called as the Poet Laureates. Have you ever wondered what does this title mean and what kind of significance does it really carry in English literature? When we talk about a Poet Laureate, he is not just another poet. He is officially appointed as a literary figure who is supposed to write poetry during significant national events, talk about the spirit of an era, and leave behind a legacy of the times that he lived in. This tradition dates back centuries, starting with Charles II when he appointed John Dryden as the first ever poet laureate in England in 1668. This tradition helps blending literature with politics, culture, and history. But you must be thinking that what is the importance of poet laureates in UGC NET English exam? Questions related to these poet laureates and their works, they frequently appear in such exams. In terms of the match the following questions, chronology-based questions, or their work-specific questions. So, in this video, I'm going to cover the top 5 most important poet laureates in English literature and also be dealing with some of the most important works that are frequently asked in UGC NET English exam. So, stick around till the end of this video and don't forget to make notes. The first poet laureate that we are going to discuss in this video is Robert Southey, one of the greatest romantic poets of his age. He was a poet laureate from 1813 until his death, and he was also considered to be one of the lake poets alongside Wordsworth and Coleridge. But apart from being a poet, Southey was so many more things. He was a historian, a biographer, a great storyteller. Have you heard of the story of Goldilocks and the Three Bears? Well, that was written by Robert Southey. Like his fellow lake poets, Southey started off as a radical. In fact, Southey and Coleridge, they hit it off together in the very beginning of their friendship. They shared very similar ideas together. In fact, both of them dreamt of setting up a utopian city in America. They even wrote a verse drama together, which is called as The Fall of Robespierre. But with the course of time, his ideas started to shift. He became a very strong supporter of Britain's institutions and eventually became a conservative. Now, this shift did not go unnoticed by his enemies. Who were his enemies? You'll be surprised to know. On the top of the list is Lord Byron. Both of them, they just hated each other and they used literature to express that hatred. Especially when we talk about Byron, he has always criticized Southey, especially in works like English Bards and Scotch Reviewers, and even Don Juan for that matter. And responding to that satirical mockery, you have Southey publishing A Vision of Judgment, again criticizing Byron. Now, Byron claps back at Southey and publishes The Vision of Judgment, trying to get back at him. So, both of them tried to ridicule each other at every chance they got. But beyond this drama, when we talk about Southey's poetry, it is worth exploring, especially his epic poem, Roderick, the Last of the Goths. Published in 1814, this epic poem was originally titled as Pelayo, the Restorer of Spain. Set in Spain, this entire story basically describes the inheritance of a throne and how Rodrigo, the central character, manages to take over that inheritance. The second poet that we are going to discuss is that one poet who truly defined Victorian era, and that is Alfred Lord Tennyson. He wasn't just any poet, he was the poet holding the position of Poet Laureate for a record-breaking 42 years. In fact, he held his position starting from 1850 until his death in 1892, making him the longest-serving laureate in history. So, what made him so special? Tennyson has this incredible ability to blend personal emotions, personal grief with this certain sort of musicality and rhythm. Take for that matter the charge of the Light Brigade, wherein he appropriately describes how the British cavalrymen, they drive straight into that disaster in the Crimean War in 1854. Knowing that they are few in number, knowing that they are going to die, the kind of bravery, the kind of courage that they had is very beautifully described in this particular poem through the masterful use of the formal features, the literary devices. And then there is his most critically acclaimed work, In Memoriam A.H.H. It is a deeply felt personal elegy that he wrote for his best friend Arthur Henry Hallam, who died because of a cerebral hemorrhage at a very young age at just 22. Now, this poem is beyond personal loss. Published in 1850, this entire work encapsulates faith, science, the meaning of life, especially when there is so much changing around us, right? Now, this entire work is huge. It spans across 133 cantos, divided into 3 sections, starting with the prologue, the main section of the poem, and finally the epilogue. The epilogue basically ends with an epithalamion. What is an epithalamion? A wedding song, celebrating the marriage of his sister, who is Cecilia. So this entire work is not just capturing pain, sorrow, or sadness. It also talks about celebration. It celebrates the potential of a new life, as we saw towards the end of the epilogue, right? But when we do talk about pain and sorrow and Alfred Lord Tennyson, then T.S. Eliot has called Tennyson to be the saddest of all English poets, and no wonder why. Apart from the works that we just discussed, Tennyson drew heavily from classical Greek mythology and produced works like Ulysses, The Lotus Eaters, and apart from that, even some short lyrics like Tears, Idle Tears or Crossing the Bar, which remain some of the most moving poems, moving verses in English literature today. If Alfred Lord Tennyson held the position of a poet laureate for 42 years, then John Masefield held it for 37 years. He was appointed as a poet laureate in England in 1930 and continued to hold this position until his death in 1967. Masefield's poetry wasn't about grand or lofty themes. It was about the everyday. It was about the sea, the English countryside. As a young boy, he was sent on a sea voyage, and it was there that he realized his love for poetry. Surrounded by sea lore, growing up with sea lore, he wanted to read more. He wanted to write, and he realized that he didn't want to be a sailor in the first place. He wanted to be a writer. And since sea was his inspiration, it never actually left his poetry. His early collection, Saltwater Ballads, captures the rawness and the romance of maritime life. It contains 2 of his most famous poems, which are Sea Fever and Cargoes. Sea Fever also opens with the most famous lines in English literature, which are, I must go down to the seas again, to the lonely sea and the sky. The way he has described the sea, the English countryside, it almost feels like we as readers, we find ourselves in the midst, in the presence of the sea and the English countryside. Now, the poet laureates that we discussed up until now, they have talked about love, sorrow, pain, grief, sadness, etc. But there is this one poet laureate who was one of the most powerful and controversial voices of the 20th century. And that was Ted Hughes, a poet, a translator, a children's writer, and a poet laureate from 1984 until his death in 1998. He was one of the most controversial figures because he talked about nature. And nature, not in the sense of how Wordsworth or Coleridge has dealt with. No, he talked about nature in its rawest form. in its most brutal and untamed form. In poems like Jaguar and Hawk Roosting, animals become symbol of survival, become symbol of dominance and power. His poems, they do not sort of romanticize nature like the late poets did. The imagery that he basically uses, it sort of embraces savagery. And this sort of also correlates to the ruthlessness in human existence. And then there is Crow, his most controversial, his most critically acclaimed work so far. Published in 1970, Crow is dark, it's surreal, it breaks away from humanity and even language itself. Based on this work, one thing is very clear, that Hughes was pushing the boundaries of poetry like never before. Wait, are all of these male poet laureates? Are there any female poet laureates in the history of England? Well, there is one. And that is Carol Ann Duffy. Carol Ann Duffy is one of the most powerful voices of contemporary poetry right now. She is a Scottish-born poet and playwright, the first female, the first Scottish-born, and the first openly lesbian poet laureate in UK, serving from 2009 to 2019. One of her most famous and critically acclaimed poetry collections is The World's Wife, that was published in 1999. One of the most interesting things that I find about this poetry collection is that it flips history, culture, literature on its head by giving voices to the silenced female characters, to the marginalized female characters in some of the most famous stories. Now, these female characters could be someone's wives, could be someone's lover, could be the female counterparts of the male characters, of the famous male characters. She reimagines these stories from a female perspective, questioning, challenging masculinity, power, and the traditional roles of women in history. She subverts this tradition of a male poet actively writing about a silent female muse. In her works, the female, the women, they speak for themselves. And her poems, they largely deal with the themes of motherhood. They talk about marriage and love, but definitely from a very fresh and unexpected perspective. And because of all of these reasons, her work is definitely a feminist classic. Now, these are some of the most important poet laureates in English literature. Apart from them, you have Robert Bridges, William Wordsworth, you also have Thomas Shadwell, Colley Cibber, and so many more. All of these poet laureates, they have written moving verses, they have written poetry that is still read today, and that is why they are extremely relevant for UGC NET English exam. But poetry is just one part of the syllabus. If you are looking for more structured guidance to crack UGC NET English exam, then you can join my live UGC NET English literature classes. In my live classes, I offer a range of courses tailored to your needs specifically, starting from the history of British literature, Indian English literature, literary theories, or even strategies to tackle the exam effectively. I'm covering everything. My goal is simple, is to make complex concepts easier to understand and retain. Not just that, but if you have any doubts related to any specific topics of English literature or anything related to UGC NET English exam for that matter, then you can check out my live doubt solving sessions in which I will be solving all your doubts, answering to all your questions related to this exam. And not just this, actually all of my classes, all my courses and sessions, they are live one-on-one sessions, which means that I can provide you personalized guidance tailored to your needs, requirements and schedule, trying to fill the possible gaps related to your UGC NET English exam preparation. So if you want to know anything about my courses, about the timings, the schedule, all the details are provided and are linked in the description box below. So don't forget to check it out. That's it for today's video, folks. If you found this video on the Poet Laureates of English Literature informative and helpful, please like it and share it with other UGC NET English aspirants as well. Also, don't forget to hit the subscribe button so that you don't miss any videos that I will be uploading on UGC NET English exam in the future. Thank you so much for watching till the end, and I'll see you in the next one.